Already doing my research and I was already busy with a lot of work. Also very appreciative of the art and culture of Banaras. So she and I met very often. She was truly appreciative of my work on the artisans, and I in turn of all the many kinds of things that she took so much of an enthusiastic pleasure in. I like to think of us as co-conspirators. We were trying to revive and keep alive many things in the past while also linking them to things in the present and thinking in a lively way about the future. Introductory snippets about some of my many artisans. And here is one person who was already about 70 or in his 60s when I did my research with metal workers. So he's from a family who works in brass and copper and German silver. His name is Mohanlal. And then I worked with many weavers. And one of the many families I got to know very closely was that of the weaver Wasim Akhtar. And in his family, his brothers and all the boys and males worked at the loom. This is one of them. And in all the associate work of preparing for the sari weaving, such as dyeing the yarn. The women in the family, from his wife to his nieces to his sister-in-law, all were zardozis. That means they worked at the embroidery form known as zardozi. Here you see Zarina, one of my favorite people, doing such a piece of work. They also do much of the preparatory work for sari weaving, that is to say, prepare the yarn, both the warp and the weft. They get the spindles and the bobbins ready, and after the sari is manufactured, they cut out the loose ends from the back side of the sari. So the women in the family are totally part of the production of the sari. And lastly, I have here Brij Mohan, one of the many artisans I knew who made the wooden toys both by hands and by the lathe machine that are a specialty of Banaras. When pilgrims come to the city, they like to often buy a little sindoor daan to take back with them, or a little pot, and it can be of brass and copper also, but very often it's made out of wood. And there are many varieties of things that are very famous from like 150 to 200 years ago from Banaras, such as, what are they called, the collective noun eludes me, but groups of devtas, groups of gods and goddesses, groups of professions, groups of instrumentalists. So they come in little boxes, you must have all seen them, very brightly colored and produced either by hand or in the case of the sindoor daan and the toys, on the lathe machine. You can actually see the wood which is used by this group of artisans under his seat. Eucalyptus wood in this case. Now I could have actually given you many more slides, and I have a collection of thousands of them because I am talking about research that was first done in 1981. And as you'll see in the progress of my talk today, I have kept up with them, and I keep going back to, of course, different artisans because the older ones pass away, but keeping up with their neighborhoods and their communities and their organizations and their occupations on the whole. But now it's been so many years from 81 that I have divided it up into decades and actually into generations. So I'm into my third generation now. So the original ones, Brij Mohan is very well, alive and well, but he was only 20 or so when I first did my research. Mohanlal was in his 60s, so it is his grandson that I now interact with, the grandson who was just a little boy of 4 or 5. I'll come to all that later. Let me proceed by telling you a little more about these artisans. Now, the first thing, the most important thing is, as you can see there, the first sentence of all is the gender. They are all male. All the artisans are male. Although I took pains to point out that much of the preparatory work, the background work, and the concluding work is done by women. But they are all behind the scenes. So these male artisans are very poor. I haven't yet met a single artisan who was economically comfortable or economically secure. They work by the hour or they work by the piece, and that's all that they have. They don't have a kitty, they don't have bank accounts for the most part, and they certainly don't make a profit which they can put by. It's all just their labor. The other thing about them is that they were always regarded, from the first time I read about them and during the course of all my research, as quote unquote backward. So that means niche form, chote log, etc., low caste people. And in today's, of course, accounting, that's probably a fortunate thing because now they can, by virtue of being SC, ST, OBC, etc., they could have presumably some privileges. But back then, they were very troubled by that because it had only been some 40, 50 years ago that they had, as communities, decided to change their labeling. The fact that that identity which stuck to them already had a name, and you could look it up in various colonial documents and publications. So they used to be called Kasera for the metal workers, and Julaha for the weavers, Badhai for the woodworkers, and so on, Tatera, and etc. There was a whole host of names that was already essentialized as a category. Apart from the colonial documents, there are local records which are in police stations. And the police stations, maybe they don't have them now, but they used to have a separate register which was called a festival register, and yet another register in which was documented all the people who lived in the neighborhood that that thana, that police station, was responsible for. When you read that, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. Every single kind of person is typified according to who they are, and that identity is focused on in a very minute way. So, how many days do they do this? Do they observe mourning after a death? What do the women wear? How do they have childbirth? What dialect of a language do they speak? Etc. 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 And as you know, that is another topic altogether. So I must not be tempted to go into that. But as many of you might know, that kind of colonial categorization, followed up by the Indians, this continued post-independence, is something that went around in a circle and then came to actually construct the identity of many of these people. So they would often even say, if I asked about the identity, they would say, you know, there is such and such a publication, why don't you go and have a look at it? And I'd say, no, you tell me who you are. And they'd say, no, no, it's very well written up there. It's all written up there who we are. You understand the irony that someone else had decided on their behalf who they were, and now they were completely fine with that categorization because the written word, simply speaking, or the official word is stronger than the oral word. So they changed their names, each one of them in turn, to Vanshi Chhatri, Ansari, and Vishwakarma, in the case of just these three artisans that I am talking about today. I think the one that is especially prevalent right now is Ansari. I think Vanshi Chhatri is an insider's name for them. They're still called Kasera as far as I know. And the Vishwakarma, because of being partly such an ambiguous term, can be actually applied to a whole lot of people who work with tools and machines of different kinds. So the work, I understood, is the most defining characteristic of the artisan. And this is important because that is what produces their poverty. If their work was different, if it was something which was more in tune with changing market demands, or if they were more flexible in their tool making or in their designing, then if their work was different, their poverty level would be different. But they are completely clear that what they do is unchangeable. And there are many subdivisions to each one that I mentioned. So, for example, a kasera is not just a kasera. A metal worker is then defined by whether he works for making puja articles or domestic utensils or does repousse work. Now, the main claim that all artisans made to me was that they love their identity because it is definable by freedom. And they used words, very, very clearly that mean that azadi, swatantrata, अपने ऊपर अपना नियम बनाना, किसी की नीचे नहीं काम करना, सर्विस नहीं करना, just to be a person who is free. That is who they wanted to be, and that is who they were. This is freedom. And I had to struggle very hard for a very long time to understand it. That what it translates into is, to begin with, open space and free time. Open space meaning public space. That not inside but outside, to use the outside. It could be a ghat, it could be a neighborhood, it could be a chabutra somewhere, it could be, most of all, the side of the street. And free time means to have absolute control over your work day. You work very, very hard, but you begin when you want and you end when you like. And you are not being controlled by anyone. And almost as if to prove it, they would just be absent when I expected them to be at work. Closed up shop and gone away. And no one knew where. So that is actually freedom. Who in this hall can claim that? I'd be interested to know. But an artisan insisted on that. And of course, there is very, very interesting literature about this precise thing by E.P. Thompson, a venerable historian of English social history, who in his book, The Making of the English Working Class, shows that one of the main changes that occurs with industrialization in Europe, and then of course in other parts of the Western world, and which I realized when I started my research had not, of course, occurred in India, was that all the artisans had gotten converted into workers, factory workers, and that they had suddenly lost what he documents also as their freedom to become slaves of the factory bell or horn or whatever it is, and to have to report in at a time and report out, and to be paid and charged fines for every minute worked or not worked. So when you read that kind of an account, then it makes sense what these artisans were talking about. Not that they knew about other histories, not that they could compare with any other kind of people, but they could sense their freedom, they instinctively knew what it was, they were very proud of it, they were very articulate about it. It was a very clearly spelled out philosophy. I have not met such articulate people as these artisans were, who could completely tell me in clear words what it is that they celebrated most in their lives. So I want to not skip over this, the fact of their poverty. To speak of both things in the same breath is the conundrum that has stayed with me and should stay with everyone. That poverty and culture are not like a scale, that you have one and you lose the other, and you have the other and you lose one. It's not like that. There's no connection actually between the two. You can have one and the other. And not have either. So the artisans teach a very valuable lesson right there, but there's something more which we have to struggle to find, which is going to make us understand it. So it's very complex. It's both work and leisure, and a sense of aesthetics, including of everyday life. Some of this was reflected in their homes. Their homes were very, very non-specialized spaces. So they could work in a space, but then it could get converted into something else once they put away their work, their loom, for example, and they could use the floor space for some other purpose. Or they could have, and this is of course a function of poverty, they could have sleeping, eating, sitting, even cooking, all in the same areas. And some of it was because the women were so versatile. They could actually switch around the usefulness of a space from one purpose to another very quickly, very smartly. Now, thanks to the ethnographic method, which means basically that you get to spend a lot of time with your informants, you hang around with them, you are there at any time you want to, and then you spend hours and they can try to chase you away, but you find an excuse and you still keep sitting there. You say, I have a stomachache, I can't go, and you keep sitting there, any excuse, or someone you're waiting for won't be back for 4 hours, and you say, I'll wait, I have to meet that person, so you keep sitting there. And it's in all these little time that you get with them while waiting, while pretending, play acting, that you get a feel of the whole life, the way the day runs, the way the routines work. So had it not been for that, had it been just a given set of questions that I had gone with, I would not have discovered the quote-unquote truth about them. And the truth, what is that? Well, here I'm trying to say that my first shock of realization was that they were quote-unquote just like me. By which I mean that they like to do exactly the things that I like to do. Socialize with friends, go for a walk whenever you feel like it, eat, drink what you want, gossip, rest, enjoy music, dance, theatre, and literature. They loved music, dance, theatre, and literature. And they had done extraordinary things. Mohanlal, this venerable old man who was mired in poverty, one day reveals that he was part of a theatre group. And of course I didn't believe him. I said, come on, you, theatre, I didn't know how to process that. And he took me to a big room, a hall, where there were curtains rolled up and kept, waiting for a performance. That's where they rehearsed, and when they performed, they rolled down a backdrop curtain, and they performed in front of it. So there was proof everywhere, there was evidence everywhere. Once I was interviewing Girija Devi, and she said out of the blue suddenly, you're interested in the culture of Banaras? Well, it's the Kaseras who are the best singers. And someone else told me, oh, Yadavs, they really sing well. Now, these are very, very poor groups, very poor communities, and you think they are working day and night to eke out a living. But in fact, what they are known among those who know them is for their music and their performance. But being the same like me is not enough. They were actually much more evolved spiritually than me, because they knew about two things that I had only read about. Leave aside practice in my life. One of them was structure, and the other is balance. Now, I'll whisk through this really fast. You all know this, there's nothing to talk about. But between the four aims of life, there better be a balance. There has to be a structure which incorporates more than one of them, and there has to be a balance in between them. So the artisans exemplified this in their lives. So for instance, it's all about dharma, doing the work that they should be doing because of their training and their heredity, but also because they absolutely love beautiful things. They would look at this piece, for instance, that I was just gifted with, and inspect it like that and say, हाँ, ये तो हम भी बना सकते हैं. आपको चाहिए हम ऐसे बना देंगे, order दीजिए, etc. Then immediately negotiate on that basis. So the beauty and the work was going together. Here's something they love to do. They love to work out in akhadas. They all were busy bodybuilding. But at the same time, they had gurus and they chanted the Ramcharitmanas and they went to lots and lots of gatherings in temples. Brij Mohan just as one character, and I literally went to meet him 5 days ago because I knew I was going to speak about him. I said, let me do his darshan. And this is a photograph from just this visit. This is how he is. And he is a kind of configuration, an epitome of all these values that you can read about in our Shastras and you can hear about in high philosophical discussions and lectures, but they live it out instinctively. So, very simply speaking, what it means is that in the work and leisure life, there has to be a balance, and that's why they are so addicted to all kinds of activities that we classify as leisure activities, such as going out and nipatna, nahana, boating, picnicking, or just wandering around in the streets. And of course, that has very, very good terms in Banaras lifestyle. It's called not only ghumna phirna, but mauj, masti, akkadpan, akkadpan. This is the artisans who live it out. It's not distant from us at all. It's right here in Banaras behind the roads. This is what it looks like, just to bring us back to reality. I'm not claiming anything romantic. I have often been pulled up for that I always romanticize the artisans. Everyone all over the world tells me, and there might be a question today also, that they are so poor, they are hunchback, they are bending over their work, they are somehow making enough to earn enough for one meal a day, and you are celebrating this and that about them. So let me say, I'm not actually being romantic. I think it's terrible. I think it's horrible, the way they live in the neighborhoods and the streets and the gullies. But at the same time, they are skilled in all these things. They can sing and dance, and they basically, I divided them up into two. Look at the last line. Those who are fond, that means those who are simply shauqeen, and those who are pagal, that means they are crazy about it. So there is one extreme kind, like Brij Mohan, who is crazy, and then there are many, many who are just shauqeen. I mean, they do everything, they love everything, but they can retain more of a balance. So I'll just give you an example from 2-3 images. So these are kaseras, and at Ganesh Chaturthi, they have set up a little jhanki of their own, in which, this is the jhanki, in which they sing themselves and they perform a lot of music, or they invite a professional singer. This is the late Mahadev Mishra. These are pictures from older research. And of course, in performances like this, which I don't know if you know, but the actors are little boys from many of the same communities. Because those are the neighborhoods. This is in Kutwa, where the performances are often held. Now we come to a darker side of the story, which is about the change in aesthetics. So I actually don't like to show you all these slides because then you'll have to read them. Let me just open this and pause. So let me talk instead. So I already mentioned that I did some research according to generations. So my first generation of artisans is whom I knew very intimately and I wrote about them repeatedly. And then I took a break and I went and did research on all kinds of other topics. But I was, of course, curious and I was attached and I was in touch personally. So when I came back, I saw that the next generation was in place. And then again, I took a break and did many other things. And then when I came back, it was the third generation that was in place. Now, what does this mean? This means, firstly, that the rule of modernity was much stronger. And modernity can be symbolized in many ways. I sometimes put the Constitution of India or the tricolor, and this simply because it's already old times. This, I don't think it's Parliament of India any longer, but here it is. What we put in place in 1947 and 1950 is what has been happening since these 70, 80 years, which is to say that we want everyone to be equal. We don't want communities to exist like artisans or anything else. But in that pursuit of equality, we need to do something which is very technical, which is very factual, and that we have also stated as a country, as a state, is going to be education. So education is the way in which everyone becomes equal, no matter what their starting off points is. Now, the story is that Mohan Lal was uneducated. All my first generation artisans were unschooled, but they all understood what was in the air. They already were familiar with what modern, secular, democratic India was going to achieve. So they all dutifully send their children to school, even the girls. They send them to school. And there was a push further in the next generation. Not enough had been achieved in one, so the children of that, the grandchildren of my first round of artisans, made sure that they sent their children, if not to government school anymore, to private schools, and then had tutors and or some kind of coaching for the children after school. They really bought into this discourse of modernity and the discourse of secularism, democracy, and equality that was put into place. And Ambedkar said such a fine thing about it. He said, it's up to us to realize that. What we do is what the Constitution will be. What we make of it is what will happen. It's a kind of cultural challenge to us. It's a kind of social or political challenge. It's not something that is an object that has already been produced and it is out there for consumption. It has to be manufactured by us. And my submission here today is that we have totally failed the artisans because the schools that they selected, whether government or private, were precisely the ones that did not give them the skills needed for any kind of mobility. As families expand, as numbers increase, and as we preach we preach individualism and choice and agency, and that actually comes to happen, artisans are not going to be able to reproduce themselves mechanically. That is like slave labor, to expect that because I was a weaver, all my progeny have to be weavers, no matter what their interests, what their teaching, training, etc., etc. So once you get rid of that notion, which is the truly modern notion, the notion of modernity, then you have to provide the means by which this change can be brought about. What our schools did, let me try to find